Do you want to have the confidence to truly rock retirement? Well, I'm going to show you how on the Retirement Answer Man Show. Hey there, welcome to the show. My name is Roger Whitney. I'm excited that you're here. This is going to be a good show. We have one of my favorite people, Fritz Gilbert, author of the Retirement Manifesto blog. And Fritz and I have known each other since he was institutionalized at the corporation. And now he's into retirement for a few years. And he's going to share his wisdom, which he actually chronicled on his blog, retirementmanifesto.com. Great blog. So we're going to talk about his journey to help you get inspired for yours. And then we're also going to talk about how do we bring this all together, all these financial and non-financial issues that we've discussed. How do we bring this together so we can actually do something about it, which is sort of the key. Now, two previews. One is next week. I'm excited because we're going to share a lot of tips from current retirees, people like you that listen to the show that may be a little ahead of you on the journey. I'm just going to share all the tips that they've shared with me over this last month or so. And then preview number 2, which I'm really excited about, is we're creating a comprehensive guide to what do you focus on if you're within 5 years of retirement that we're just going to share with you if you receive our weekly 6-Shot Saturday email. So it's not ready yet. It's in production. So when it's ready, we're going to share it in 6-Shot Saturday. So if you're not signed up for that, you can go to rogerwhitney.com and put in your name and email. We promise not to spam you, and you'll get the guide as soon as it's done. With that, let's get on with the main show. Marathon. What is a marathon? Well, retirement is a marathon because if you're 50 or 60, you have 40, 50 plus years maybe. That's a marathon. A marathon is a long-lasting operation of a specific kind. And in this context, the marathon is rocking retirement and making sure you're okay. And if you've ever done an actual marathon, it is a very long operation of trying to get to the finish line. 2 miles down the road. I've done a marathon. I've done an Ironman, which is 140 plus miles. And yes, it's a long operation, but if you've ever done one and had my experience, it's literally, I got to get to that stop sign over there. I just got to get to that stop sign over there. Please let me get to that stop sign over there. And then I just got to get up this hill. I just got to make it to that aid station. I just got to make it to that line 3 feet in front of me. Please. It becomes this series of sprints that psychologically help you break up the monotony and the intimidation factor of this marathon. So any long journey, if you look at the entire journey, it can really be overwhelming. What about long-term care? What happens if somebody dies early? What am I going to do when my body starts to not work the way I want it to work? What about inflation? What about sequence of return when I'm 80? All these things can be very intimidating if you look at the entire journey. But just like life, raising kids, going to college, building your career, you have to break it up into shorter term sprints. You just got to get to the stop sign and then to the next stop sign. And that's what we call a sprint, which in project management parlance is a set period of time during which a specific task or tasks must be accomplished. Just get to the stop sign. And I think for you, especially if you're on this runway to begin the marathon, which is always the most stressful part, by the way, when you're preparing to do something that is different, something you've never done before, that's going to take a lot of time, it's intimidating. I'll tell you, the most stressful part for me in any adventure race or triathlon that I've done is always right beforehand. Because you get in your head. You're thinking about all that you have to do and you haven't done any of it yet. So It's okay to be stressed. It's okay to be a little anxious about things. But if you start to go through some of the things that we've talked about this month, you can walk yourself back from that anxiety. And one way to do that is by setting these short-term sprints. What can I do next? If you're sitting at the starting gate of retirement, say that's 3 years out, you got to plan for this long journey for sure. You got to map out your nutrition, got to make sure your body, your finances are in shape and prepared for it. But ultimately, what can you do while you're standing there? Can you stretch? Can you eat a little nutrition? Can you make a joke with a friend to cut the anxiety or the tension? You can do the same things as you're planning for retirement. So what do you do? All right, so where you want to go from here, whether you're 5 years or you're 1 year from retirement, you got to build your retirement model. And that starts with vision. Do you have a vision of sort of what you want out of retirement? My suggestion is to do values like we talked about earlier this month. Reassess your values, which should represent what you want your life to look like, what you want to be living out, who you want to become with all this time freedom you're going to have. Maybe one of your values is adventure, but you haven't had as much time. Well, then you can map out, well, I want to do adventurous things, and this is what those things mean to me, because that's going to allow you to figure out who you and your spouse want to become. That's really important here because you're institutionalized and you may not have revisited some of this stuff for a while. And you're going to get it wrong, but that's okay because it's a marathon. Once you have a sense of what you want this life of freedom to look like, you organize your resources. What cash flow is going to pay for this? Your social capital, your human capital, your financial capital. You want to organize your net worth statement. This is all the stuff that we've talked about this entire month. And then you want to pick a target date of when you're going to do it. This is the starting line. It's important to pick the starting line. It's January 1st, 2023. Because once you pick the starting line, now you can start working towards that date. And that helps organize the things that you should focus on. But what if you say, well, hey, Roger, I don't know what the starting line is. I don't know exactly where it is. That's okay, because you can move it. In my practice, walking with clients, they move it all the time. They move everything all the time, what they want out of life and everything else, but they move the starting line. It doesn't matter that it's going to move. You want to have one picked because that's going to help organize what you're working towards. And you can move it later on as you iterate with these sprints. And then once you've sort of thought about who you want to become, organize the resources that you're going to marshal to start this journey, you've picked the starting date of this journey, now you can look at identifying risks and opportunities. You can identify financial risks and opportunities. I'm sitting here, I have a little bit of tax diversification risk. I don't have a lot in after-tax assets, so I could run up the tax brackets in retirement. That's a risk, but it's also an opportunity because I see this 4 years out. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's an opportunity to start mapping out how you take a portfolio, an investment portfolio, and go from accumulation to decumulation, which is a very different way of portfolio management, I think, personally. Most people in my industry, as well as most individuals, don't understand how different portfolio management is in retirement than it has been throughout your life. In fact, maybe I should do a whole month just on that because it is really critical. Financial risk or opportunity could be your liquidity, how much cash reserves you have. It could be renesting, buying those cars, getting the healthcare, that operation you've been meaning to get done, renovations on the house. Maybe there's an opportunity to do that while you're still working, so you can cash flow it. On the non-financials, it could be the social network. It could be your health. It could be, and this is one that we haven't talked a lot about, starting to set boundaries between work and life. Because work tends to, especially modern work, 24/7, always connected work, tends to take over cell phones and emails and texts and everything else. And if you've been building a career for decades and going the extra mile for decades, it's likely that you're hardwired into always going the extra mile, raising your hand, and doing what's needed for the company, which is beautiful. It's admirable. But as you get closer to retirement, perhaps it's time to say, I don't need to be on the career advancement treadmill anymore. Doesn't mean I'm not going to do a great job. I just don't need to prove myself anymore. So I'm going to start building boundaries between work and life. I'm actually going to turn off at 5. I'm not going to volunteer for the extra projects. I'm going to start carving out some time so I can really turn off and start thinking about this other domain of my life. Maybe it's boundaries. And you can review the last episodes and listen to Fritz and I talk and all the tips we're going to get next month. But you want to identify these risks and opportunities and then choose 1 or 2 to work on. Make those your initial sprints. Put into place whatever it is you need to do to start working on that. And then you can revisit, look at your risks and opportunities, and then choose the next one. This will get you prepared for the race. Here's the secret, though. You're never, ever fully prepared for the race. Every race that I've done, I've been a little undertrained. Probably could have done a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that. But when the gun goes off and I'm running or I'm cycling or I'm swimming, it's the culmination of all the preparation I've done before. The long hours, running in the rain, riding on my bicycle trainer, stretching, being sore, coming home, I'm tired. Race day, when the race starts, when retirement starts, that should be the most enjoyable journey that you're on. You've worked decades to build your financial nest egg and to raise a family or to build something. Race day should be the best day. That marathon should be a blast. So when I think of marathons and these long-term endurance races, to stick with this analogy, I'm never trying to win in the sense of beating someone else. I'm not fast enough. I don't want to commit to being fast enough to be at the top of the pack. I want to run my race, and I always did. I just ran my race. I remember the Ironman, which took me like 15 hours. I had just an amazing day. I was the happiest guy. I was saying hi to everybody that passed me on the bike. I said hello to the 87-year-old lady that just jogged by me on the marathon. I didn't care. I just had so much fun. I thanked every volunteer. Race day was always fun for me. Doesn't mean I didn't suffer at times, but I just had this happy spirit about it. So for you, in retirement, you've put in all the work. This approach is just getting yourself dialed in. You're not going to be fully prepared when you retire, but when you retire, it should be joyous. And yeah, you're going to have struggles, but this should be something that you're really excited about. Don't get too intimidated by this. You're going to figure it out as long as you're being really intentional about your decisions. Now, Aaron Q sent me a note. Aaron said, I've been listening to your yearly planning sessions with individuals, and I went back to listen to the first Carl back in 2015, which is hard to believe. And she said, I want to know how successful Carl has been 5 years later. Did he retire at 52, at 55? Did his planning process, was it useful, the thing that we went through? What was the real benefit? Did the assumptions hold true? So many questions. She wants to know how Carl did. It was funny because this came in after I talked with Fritz. So Aaron, Carl is actually Fritz Gilbert. He came out publicly a few years ago on the show, I believe. So why don't we chat with Fritz and see how he's doing and the answers to your questions. So here we are, the segment on the wisdom from those that have gone before you, those that are retired. And the first person I thought of that I wanted to talk to on this series is Fritz Gilbert from the Retirement Manifesto. He's written a lot about this.
I'm honored by that, Roger. Thank you.
Welcome to the show. Yeah. I said you've written a lot about it. I didn't say it was great. No, it's awesome. It's awesome.
Yeah, there you go. You know, but it is interesting that you thought of that as somebody who is now in retirement, because, you know, when I started writing, I was exactly where this series is focused on. I was in what I call the red zone. I think that's a term in the industry. You know, these 5 years prior to retirement, I was 3 years out when I started writing. So I lived 3 years of the red zone while I was writing the Retirement Manifesto. And now I've been writing for 3 years post-retirement. So it's got a nice symmetry to it. And I think it's a good fit into your topic this month because I can speak very personally of the experience going through the red zone. And now I can look back kind of going through those phases of retirement, and I can see the effectiveness that planning had on ultimately life in retirement, which I think is a big interest to people that are still in the red zone and planning for it. So I think it's great. I think it'll be fun to talk through it with you.
Yeah, and the idea of writing is no different than journaling. It's intentional reflection because a lot of times we forget how worried we were or obsessed we were about one particular aspect of planning. We forget that, and we think that we were always where we're at in the moment. And so you have that record of your trials and tribulations.
Yeah. And what I found interesting, and it actually fits perfectly into what you're talking about. I think I shared with you on an email. It'll probably get in your show notes, but the ultimate pre-retirement checklist. And what that came about was shortly after I retired, I was like, I should capture some of these phases that I've been through and kind of put together a timeline type of post. And what did I learn going through this experience? And I read through my archives and all the articles I'd written as I was going through it. And I said, what were the most important points? And I pulled those out and I built this checklist. And it's really interesting, to your point, to look back and see what I was thinking as I went through various stages of the planning, and then to kind of take a more holistic approach at the broader planning process and to compile it all into one checklist was really could only be done, I think, if you'd kind of been journaling weekly through the process.
Yeah, and I'm sure you identified a lot of things that were maybe initially on the checklist or things that you did, and you're like, oh, that wasn't important. I thought it was, but I didn't need to focus so much there.
Yeah, but I would say for the most part, the way I captured my checklist, when I was going through it myself, obviously I hadn't done it yet, right? So I kind of had a checklist that I was keeping of things I needed to make sure I got done. Especially as you get closer and closer to retirement, obviously, it gets much more time sensitive. But I found myself that checklist, I kept the items that I had checked off. And there wasn't too much stuff that I was thinking I had to do that was wasted energy. Certainly, some of it was more valuable than others. And I think I've heard your first 2 segments. I think when we record this now, you've had 2 of them that have aired, and you're spot on with the advice you've given in the first 2 episodes of the series. They are absolutely down my checklist. It's like, wow, did Roger look at my stuff? I mean, you do it for a living, obviously. It's not rocket science. You know the process, but that advice you've given in the series is pretty much exactly the process I followed. It's solid advice.
Well, let's start with the financial side of things. From a checklist. I mean, there are a lot of things in the checklist, and we'll obviously share the articles in 6 Shot Saturday so people can get access to those. But let's start with the big rocks financially. What did you have on the checklist that you knew you had to have in place to have the confidence to do it?
Yeah, good question. And I think you've touched on it, but I'll reiterate the points that you made that I was like, amen, when I was hearing you say it. And I would think the biggest one for me was we've never been budgeters, right? I've talked to you enough, you know that. We always saved aggressively. We knew we had enough saved, so we lived on the rest. And we didn't try to go through and categorically how much we're spending on housing. And we knew if it was in our checking account, we could spend it. So I wasn't comfortable planning for retirement without really having a grasp of what is our retirement spending most likely going to look like. So one of the items on my checklist was to track your actual spending by category. Every receipt, everything I spent for 11 months. We tried to go a year, and we just, after 11 months, we made it 11 months. So I'm pretty proud of that. But every single thing we spent, and this was maybe 2 years prior to retirement, and we tracked it by category. And then what we did was we said, okay, this is pre-retirement. Now let's make a second column for how those things are going to change in retirement. And I think in the last episode, you talked about discretionary versus necessary expenses. We did that. What is our absolute must-have just to live what'd you call it? A minimally acceptable lifestyle or something. You had a nice word for it. You gave credit to somebody else. We had that category. And then we had kind of the things we wanted to do. An example, we've been RVing and we took 3 months and went out to Seattle 2 years ago. So we had a line in our post-retirement budget for RV travel. Obviously, it wasn't in our pre-retirement spending, but we knew that it was something we were going to do. So 100 nights, $30, $35 a night on campgrounds, and so many miles driving at 10 miles a gallon, pulling this big rig, those types of things. Health insurance, the other big one. Employer provided it. Post-retirement, we were going to have to pay for it on our own. What's that going to look like? And we projected it. So that's number one, was we did an initial baseline actual spending. and revised it to post-retirement, making conservative assumptions, basically estimating high so that we'd have a little bit of cushion in our number. So that was number one. And number two was the 5-year cash flow projection that you had recommended. We did it out through age 95. Who knows? It's a guess. But we really wanted to see how things looked over time as we pulled from IRA versus Roth versus, so the taxable account stuff that you've talked about, laying that out in a cash flow timeline. I've got our cash flow spreadsheet that we use. It's on my website. It's free for users, for readers to use. But projecting it out beyond just a snapshot in year one is also helpful because it lets you see how things are going to change in time, the go-go years, slow go, no-go, and the increase in healthcare as you get older, maybe a catastrophic event, some of the scenario testing, negative scenarios. We could play with that in the spreadsheet. So I think those were probably on the financial side, the two biggest things that we did.
Yeah, we definitely project out for the lifetime, but it can be overwhelming when you look at it because it's so, it might be 40 years.
Yeah.
And so I have a question for you on the dialing in the spending. Number one is, were there any surprises now that you're 3 years in of whether it's healthcare expenses or things that were much higher than expected or much lower than expected?
I would say almost all of our surprises have been to the good. We intentionally made almost every category forecast a little bit on the high side. I'm a conservative investor. When we did the Can Carl Retire case study on your show, we were answering the question, could I retire at age 54? And the number said, yes, you could. I decided to work an extra year. So that was a conservative action, right?
That's a bigger one than you think too, because it's not just another year, it's another year saving, another year without spending, all those things.
It makes a big difference. And in our experience, it's worth it in the end. That year is tough, but now that I'm in retirement, having that extra cushion is significant. So I guess because of that, most of our surprises have been to the good. We estimated $2,500 a month for health insurance. My wife and I are fully on individual health insurance. We're paying $1,900 a month. So it's still a lot of money, but when you plan $2,500 and it's coming in at $1,900, it's like, hey, that's okay. It's great to have a $2,000 health insurance bill and be happy with it. It's crazy, right? But that's the value of having conservative assumptions. And the other assumption I would say is that we assumed no income in retirement. Everybody said, oh, you'll make money in retirement. I said, well, maybe I will, maybe I won't. I don't want to have to make money in retirement. If we make money, fine. And sure enough, the blogs generated a little bit of income. The books generated some income. I got invited to be on a board of directors once a quarter, minimal amount of time, but it's generated some income. So the income has been higher than we expected, and the spending has been lower than we expected. And what we've done as a result is that, look, we've read so many studies about people. It's funny, when you're planning for retirement, you're so worried if you're going to have enough money. But most people, when they get into retirement and they've been diligent their whole life to save, and I know you've had episodes on this, most people underspend what they can spend in retirement. We said, we're not going to let that happen. If we can, we'll see what happens, but we're going to make sure we spend our safe withdrawal rate. So we've had more money than we planned. So I built my workshop. I'm in my writing studio now. This was something that we did as a result of those conservative estimates in our spending. So I would say our surprises were all, fortunately, knock on wood, thus far, they've all been to the good.
But I would imagine slowing down and having conservative estimates, working the extra year, when you go through a major life change, all those conservative estimates and decisions give you more confidence because it's a little bit like going into the great unknown.
Absolutely. There's a balance though, Roger, because if you get too conservative, you could end up working longer than you have to, right? It's a question of, it's unknowable if you have enough money. You don't know what the market returns are going to be. You don't know what inflation is going to be. You don't know what your healthcare is going to be. There are too many unknowns to ever fully know if you have enough. And I think the danger is if you get too conservative, you never have that courage to step over what I call the starting line. Definitely. And that's a real shame because life in retirement is absolutely, in our case, it's been absolutely wonderful. Best years of our lives. And it's a shame if you forego some of those really valuable, young, healthy retirement years because you're being too conservative in your estimates. So there's the balance there.
I would even go further than that. And I don't have a quote that I wrote down. I don't know if it was a client or it was someone. And I asked them about the wisdom back. And in hindsight, they wish they would have retired earlier. It's a little bit like having children. You're never 100% emotionally and financially prepared for children.
Yeah.
But if you have them earlier than you were expecting, it works out.
Yeah.
If you retire a year earlier, you're still going to figure it out. It may be slightly a different journey, but you're likely going to be okay, assuming you did all the normal thing, the big rocks right from saving perspective.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's the key. Get the big rocks right. Make reasonable assumptions. If you're a conservative risk profile, hedge your bets a little bit, but don't go extreme. And then make sure, and I guess this is the biggest thing that I learned, and this came through some of the research I was doing in my last couple of years of work. The numbers are the numbers. They don't change a lot. As you're getting closer and closer, you start doing some retirement calculators, maybe 5 years out. You start getting more fine-tuned. You start doing the cash flow, maybe 2 years out. Well, by the time you're about a year out, your numbers, if you've been going through kind of a 5-year exercise here, your numbers are pretty well locked in. And the one thing that I think was the greatest value for us, and I know you're going to have a dedicated episode on this, is to make sure, I would say it's almost as important as the financial. It's debatable. You got to have the financials, obviously, but you've got to spend time thinking about the non-financial areas as well. Hugely important.
Yeah, we're going to pivot there for sure. And on having the numbers, it's interesting. In the Rock Retirement Club, as part of the membership, people get the premium planner from New Retirement. And then they have the spreadsheet-based household balance sheet in the master class. And it's interesting because as you get closer, you want to just keep running the numbers. And some of the questions that we'll have in meetups is, this one says one thing and this one says something slightly different. Why don't they match? Right? Which is a natural thing. No doubt there's probably 4 other calculators that were free online that they used as well. It's like a quadruple blind study and you're never going to have them match up, but they still should be in the same trajectory. And that's good enough. A lot of times we get on this pursuit of trying to be more precise, thinking that it's going to be more accurate, and precision and accuracy are not the same thing, especially when you're dealing with
great quote.
Yeah.
Great quote. And I would say get it to 95% and get on with life. 95% is accurate enough. My recommendation in my checklist is to run at least 3 retirement calculators. To your point, if they're directionally aligned, maybe one says you're good to go in 2025. One says you're good to go in 2026. Okay, that's pretty close. They have different black box algorithms. You don't really know what's in there. And don't stress over that. Think, okay, I got my numbers pretty good. I'm in 2025, 2026, somewhere in that time frame, and then start working through the other stuff that matters.
So on the financial side, before we pivot, what other big rocks that we haven't talked about would you say are on your checklist?
Yeah, and this was the third one I was going to bring up. One was the track your actual spending, put together projected spending, run it through a time series. The other one, I think, of the whole experience is to really think through how you're going to move from a lifetime of accumulation to a period of withdrawal. And the way that you manage your portfolio when you're in the middle of your career and you're just saving every month and you just put it on automatic and you forget about it is entirely different than the way you go about managing your portfolio when you're moving into the withdrawal phase.
Entirely different.
Entirely different. Yeah, it's baseball versus sailing, right? It's not even in the same ballpark. It's really, really different. And the important thing is you've got to have that in place on day one of retirement. You don't want to wait until you retire and then say, okay, what do I need to do? Oh, I need to build up some liquidity and after-tax funds because I can't get to my retirement accounts yet. It's too late, right? You've got to start planning that strategy for how you're going to pull money out of your accounts a couple of years before you get there because it takes some time to put it into place. So that to me is probably the number 3 big rock.
And I'm working on, in fact, I just came from a hotel where I spent 6 hours working on the next module for the master class, which is how do you allocate your assets now that you have your spreadsheet and you're spending down all the things that came before it. And if you think of how you invest for accumulation, generally it's modern portfolio theory, asset allocation.
Right.
It looks at risk in the frame of time horizon and setting expectations for what you might see happen in the portfolio in terms of return and volatility. It takes no consideration for your life and spending. All it cares about is optimizing for growth over a very long period of time.
Yep.
When you're investing for retirement, it looks at risk totally different because the risk, the number one risk, and you can disagree if you'd like, the number one risk is the outcome. What's the severity of the outcome if you can't fund your consumption, right?
Yep. And it's also the number one worry. I've done some articles on what's the biggest worry people have about retirement, and it's running out of money before you die, right? So it's important. It's important stuff because you don't want to run out of money. So yeah, it's all that. And it's time matters. the same as an accumulation phase. But in accumulation phase, you're looking for the compounding effect and you want it to be in there invested so it has time to get up that sharp curve. In retirement, it's almost the opposite. It's how do you live in the short term without getting hit by a sequence of return risk? Big bear market downturn, you've got to have that liquidity, but you still have to get the return so you don't run out of money before you die. So it's that balance that is the most critical part of the withdrawal stage versus the compounding and the aggressive growth in the accumulation phase.
Yeah,
my experience.
Yeah, so you construct a portfolio totally differently. And I think people don't understand that. And that's when you want to start addressing that before you get there, as you say, because if you have those if you're like a Mustang on jet fuel risk-wise, because that's worked for you for 20, 30, 40 years, well, you don't want to ride that in retirement and you don't want to crash right before the finish line.
Exactly. And this is one area I will say, I've always been a do-it-yourselfer, but this is one area, and I say this in my book, if you're not 100% comfortable in this discussion that we're having right now, this is an area that it pays to hire a professional. It's that important. Even if you've been a do-it-yourself and you're not quite sure about how you want to structure things for the withdrawal phase, even if you do kind of a one-off retirement ready check or something, and this is where I approached you and said, hey, can we go through this Can Carl Retire exercise? Because getting this part right is so important because this is what determines if you're going to have money to last through your lifetime. It's worth paying somebody if you have to.
Yeah. Or I would say going through the master class where you build your
there
structure
you go.
out. It costs a lot less.
Nice plug for the club. I like the Rock Retirement Club, by the way. Thanks for having me in there. I really enjoy it. It's fun. I'm doing a session by the time this airs, I guess it'll be over. But we're just to give the listeners a little taste. We're doing a special in-club discussion about second houses in retirement, right? We just bought our little second house down near my daughter in Southern Alabama. So we're going to get on, Beachwalker and I are going to get on there and talk about the things to think about when buying a second home. So yeah, it's great stuff.
I'm going to listen because I'm noodling on buying a second home. So
Colorado? Hey, all right. Good for you.
I would rather buy in Alabama. I think it's less expensive in Alabama.
Yeah, we only paid $130 for our little place down there. It's very cheap.
I think I could get like a sidewalk square for that in Colorado. It seems that way. So let's switch to the non-financial end of it. I had this thought the other day, and I want to get your idea on this. When you think of the non-financial side, in my mind, it's one of the most underappreciated things to prepare for. And a lot of times anxiety can really ramp up as you're getting close to retirement, obviously because of the financial stuff. But sometimes I think the anxiety increases and the anxiety we apply to the financial stuff, but it's really coming from the non-financial stuff that we haven't really acknowledged. And so we misapply where that anxiety is because we don't really acknowledge, oh, who am I going to hang out with? What am I going to do every day? But we still get anxious about it. We just don't know where it's coming from.
That's an interesting thought, Roger. I had not thought of it that way. And you may well be right. I guess my recognition of the importance of the non-financial came from a lot of the people that I had talked to in my workplace that had retired, or I've always kept in touch with people as they're going through this transition, probably since I was in my 40s. It's always been an interest. And the number of people after they retire that say, wow, I had no idea how big a change this is going to be. Very few of them talked about the financial side. That was number one. And then number two is just a personal interest. This happened totally by happenstance, or maybe it was meant to be, but serendipity. I started asking about 6 months before I retired. I started asking old people, like in their 80s. I was 6 months away from retirement. So it just hit me one time. I was talking to this older couple. We were having a great chat. I just happened to run into them. Didn't know them. And I said, hey, by the way, I write a blog. And I said, I'm 6 months away from retirement. Would you mind if I ask you one question? And I said, would you mind if I record it? And they're like, yeah, it's fine. So I hit record and I said, what one piece of advice would you give to somebody who's 6 months away from retirement to have the best chance at a great retirement? And I asked that question to probably 10 people, some real characters. I met a guy who was a World War II pilot, bomber pilot. I met really fascinating stories. Almost every single one of them said the same thing. And none of it was about money. It was all about finding the thing that gets you excited about life and retirement. And that was a huge light bulb for me. Now that I've gone through it, I've recognized the exact same thing. And it's golden advice from a lot of people in their 80s. And it's something worth listening to, because you look at either people that have just entered retirement and they're like, whoa, I didn't expect this big of a change. Or you talk to people who have been in it for decades and they say the same thing, right? It's the non-financial areas that are going to really determine how successful your retirement is. And that's really what my book is all about, is focusing on how do you do that? Because it's not like the numbers. You can't just put it in a spreadsheet, right? It's all intangible. It's all fluffy stuff.
Places sometimes we don't feel comfortable going.
Exactly. But it really matters. It really matters.
I feel like we're kindred spirits because I've done the same thing. I've gone up to people. Can I ask you a question and record it? I think that's really important. So how did you find yours? What did you do with that?
I'll tell you how I found mine, and I'll tell you how my wife found hers. And I think they're both pretty good examples of how people do it. It's almost always by serendipity. You can't sit there 2 years before retirement and say, oh, what's going to give me purpose in retirement? That's a really hard, what does that even mean, right? But let me put one more context in here, and then I'll tell you how my wife and I found it. When you leave the workplace, you don't only leave the paycheck behind. You leave your network of friends. You leave your daily purpose for living. You've got a routine. You've got structure. You've got certain time you get up. You've got to be on the road by a certain time. You've got your objectives from your boss. You've got the challenges. You've got to do this presentation. And then you do the presentation and you crush it and you get that motivation and that reward. All of that stuff is what ends with retirement.
And if you think about it, Fritz, that cycle of that continuation started in preschool.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what I write about. For the first time since I actually say that in my book, for the first time since you're 4 years old, and even more so because when you were 4, you still had your parents telling you what to do. So really, for the first time in your life, you are totally free to do what you want to do. And that's exhilarating beyond words. At the same time, it ought to scare the hell out of you.
It's paralyzing to some.
Yeah, it is. It's overwhelming. So how do you do it? Okay, I guess macro level, and then I'll go through the examples. One thing I would recommend people to do is think about ways that you can give back. Finding a way that you can do things that help other people and focus on others more than yourself is a really rewarding thing to do in retirement. And it's the first time in your life that you're really able to do that. You don't have to earn your paycheck anymore. You can take your time and invest it for the benefit of other people. And the reason I bring that up, if I think about my writing, how did I discover that? But more importantly, why does it motivate me? And what motivates me about it? Number one, I found I love the process of writing. I love thinking about ideas, trying to develop them into a logical flow, make it interesting. But most importantly, the reader feedback that I get and knowing that you're making a difference in thousands of people's lives by the words that you say, man, that's motivating, right? It's really, really motivating.
That's the same reason for the show.
Yeah, exactly. And I think finding those types of things. So how did I find it? It was purely serendipity. And this is what I really encourage people. If you've got a little bit of an interest, pursue it. I kind of thought, oh, maybe someday I'll start a blog. I'd listen to podcasts voraciously because I was driving a long way to work. I listened to you from day one. And I listened to a lot of podcasts, always on 2X. I was filling my brain with podcasts. I really enjoy personal finance and retirement. Man, I ought to start writing about this stuff. Didn't have a clue, right? But I had a curiosity. So I took the first step. How do you start a blog? I Googled it and started building my blog. And I found out in time, I figured it out. I love it. It's great. And off we go. And I found one of the things that's become my purpose in retirement. My wife's story, similar. She's helping other people. She started a charity and she's got a whole group of volunteers. It's a great community. We have a lot of fun. And we build free fences for low-income families that have their dogs on chains. And how did that start?
That's a very specific cause, by the way.
Yeah. And most people, like in areas where you have chain laws and stuff where people can't keep dogs on chains, they don't get it because it's not a common problem. But we live in Appalachia, right? We're on the border of Georgia and Tennessee, and there's a lot of dogs on chains here. And it's not against the law. So you can call animal control, but they'll go out there and say, oh, looks like they got food, looks like they got water. They're not breaking the law. There's nothing they can do. So it's the gap. So she identified a gap and it's helping other people, right? She had no idea how to build a fence. She had no idea how to start a charity. But she saw a YouTube special where Mike Rowe was doing a returning the favors where he profiles different charities. And there was a charity doing the same thing out in Oregon. And just a light bulb went off. I remember when she got done watching that video, she came in, she goes, I think I want to start a charity. And I was like, what? Came out of the blue. And she just had that eagerness and that curiosity. And most importantly, she took the first step. She figured out, how do I do it? And she started, same with me with the blog. How do you do it? You Google and you just figure it out and you start taking those steps. And I really believe if it's something that you're meant to be doing, it just happens. If it's something that you're inspired by, something that fits your personality, and you don't really know that at the time, the only way you can discover that is just take that first step, explore it. So my advice is to anybody that doesn't really know, don't get too hung up in it. Don't get all caught up in just pursue stuff that kind of interests you. And you might throw 10 things up against the wall and maybe only one or two will stick. That's plenty. One or two things that you really care about is enough to give you a great retirement. And that's what you should be thinking about in the last year before you retire, is what is it that I'm going to try to explore that might turn into something like that? Very important stuff.
And I think what you said at the last is one of the most important parts of it, is this isn't something you can workshop necessarily in a hotel for a day and a half.
No.
It's sort of, if you recall when you were a kid or had kids, they had that experimental phase where they tried a zillion different activities and none of them stuck. That is essentially the process. Oh, I like gymnastics. I'm thrilled about it. And then all of a sudden it peters out. That's okay. Yep. It's the curiosity, I guess is the...
And you said back starting as a 4-year-old, we've been pushed into this system, right? Well, it's the same thing with our curiosity. It's been squashed since we were 4 years old, right? And we've been pushed into the system of compliance. And it takes a while to get that, I guess, the left side of your brain or right side, I get confused, but that artistic side of your brain, it's been dormant for so long. It takes a while to kind of get that started.
And I think the other important point with this, and we're going to do a whole month-long series on building your non-financial plan in a couple months.
Good.
Probably have you back.
There we go.
But I think the other important point in this, you have a blog that talks to tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands. Your wife has this charity and this noble cause for dogs. When we start thinking of these ideas of purpose, we think we're supposed to have that thing that's going to change the world, right? And we can put a little pressure on ourselves. And from walking life with many that have gone through this, it could, I have examples of someone who mows lawns. That's his purpose. He loves being outside. He loves being meticulous with it. Greeting people at Walmart, being the friendly face, being a great grandmother is purpose enough for some.
I know a guy who loves to pick up trash. He just likes to pick up trash.
Or build a boat, do whatever. The key is it doesn't have to be outwardly impressive to anybody else.
Exactly.
And sometimes we put that pressure on ourselves.
I agree. Yeah. And the other thing I would say, this is a little bit of a segue, but I would also say, don't get too stressed about this. Recognize that you've got freedom now. There's nobody telling you what you have to do. So it's time to go out in the sandbox and just play around for a while and just have fun. The first 6 months of retirement are a blast regardless, because it's just like you're on vacation and you're in that honeymoon phase and it's a blast. So it doesn't really hit you until maybe you're a year in. If you haven't kind of found something yet, that's when it kind of starts becoming more apparent. So take your time, relax, enjoy it. Enjoy the honeymoon. The honeymoon's great. And don't stress too much about it. That's number one. And number two, don't ever stop that exercise of pursuing things that interest you. I'm 3 years into retirement, and I've just recently discovered kind of a new thing, right? I'm really getting into woodworking, and I've built a woodworking shop, and I'm getting to the point now where I'm getting multiple things competing for my time that are all equally exciting for me. Man, that's a good problem to have, right? So it's not something that you should just, I'm going to find my thing and that's it. It's something that you should plan on doing the rest of your life. I don't think it'll ever change.
I was talking with someone in the club in private office hours, just like a year or two ago, and he had done the same thing. His was volunteering, but all of a sudden he's like, I'm on all these boards and they're all really fun, but I feel like I just created my own job.
Yeah.
Right. So he was trying to make sure he started to say no a little bit more, knowing that, like, we'll talk about you. I think this would be a better example of, you've written your blog for 6 years now, every week.
Yep.
And recently you announced that you're not going to worry about doing it every week. I'm guessing that was one of those decisions, right?
Yeah, it was. And I tell you, it was a hard decision to make.
I think I sent you a text that it was an easy decision, but hard to actually do because you feel like you're letting people down or yourself down.
Exactly. And I don't have to ask permission from anybody, right? I'm retired. I'm my own boss. At the same time, you feel a sense of obligation because you get the emails, you get the comments, you get that feedback. And that's why I decided to write that post. I've followed, I don't know how many blogs. I mean, over 100 probably in the last 10 years. And I don't think I've seen anybody who has kind of verbally come out like I did and said, you know what, I'm going to take a little bit different tact. Here's why. But if you look, almost 80, 90% of people that were blogging into retirement within a couple of years after retirement, they're not blogging anymore. They found something else that's given them their purpose. They just haven't kind of exposed it to the world. I'm very transparent with my writing. And basically, that's what I said is, look, this is starting to feel like a job. I didn't say that, but you said it earlier and it triggered the thought. The main reason being, I was starting to feel a sense of obligation of having to meet a weekly deadline. And it was starting to put a little bit of pressure. I was starting to get a lot of other stuff going on, and suddenly it was starting to get squeezed for time. And I said, wait a minute. I look at it as kind of rebalancing your wheels.
I think that's the way you framed it. Yeah.
Yeah. I talked about the spokes and keeping the spokes the same length. But I think that recalibration as you go through retirement, the goal setting, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't have to be a formal process. But if you're starting to feel conflicted, hey, it's all within your control, right? So that was really the background for why I did it. And the response has been fantastic.
Well, I think the fact that you did it publicly also shares some wisdom and is another lesson for those that are coming behind you.
Yeah.
Right.
I hope so.
One of the top 5 regrets of those dying is I wish I would have lived a life more true to myself and not what other people expected of me.
Exactly.
And you leaned into that. And it's hard to lean into that because you feel like you're letting people down.
I love that story, by the way. I wrote an article about that palliative nurse too, and it really important lessons. But this made me think of one more thing that fits into your checklist. One of the things I did, and this was probably 2 months before retirement, and it's totally relevant to the topic we're having right now. I came up with my 10 commandments for retirement. I can show it to you. It's hanging on the wall, right? I see it every day. And I kind of wrote down for myself what were kind of my self-imposed guidelines for how I wanted to live my life in retirement. The first one was have an attitude of gratitude, but one of them was make no obligations, right? Keep yourself flexible. And the blog, as much as I love writing, and I'm sure I'll continue to write, I love to write and I love the engagement, but the weekly cadence to it was starting to feel like an obligation. And I said, wait a minute, back up 3 years, look at the 10 commandments. I wasn't going to get myself into a situation where I was imposing obligation on myself. This is a self-imposed obligation. Take it off. So it's really good in maybe the last 3 months before you retire to take a little bit of time and be reflective and get a journal or something and write down kind of what do you want your guidelines to be? Because I'm a living example of somebody who went back 3 years later and looked at that thing that I wrote 3 years ago, and it triggered a change in the way I was living my retirement. It's important stuff.
Yeah. And for me, I say that as value. Revisit. A lot of people have never done it. Define what your, say, 10 values are, which are sort of your guiding lights, like your commandments.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well done. Well, I'm so thankful that you were willing to share your wisdom with the world over the last 6 years and for maybe ever more. And very thankful that you were willing to share it with us here today.
Well, thank you, Roger. It's funny. I think back to, let's say 7 years ago, you were starting your show and I was just one of hundreds of thousands of people out there thinking about retirement. And it's really rewarding for me to have kind of developed this area of my interest to the point where you and I are friends. I appear on your show. We're very compatible. We're teaching the same lessons to the same audience, if you will. And it's really neat to think that not that long ago, I was just like everybody else that's listening to this. I was just somebody out in the crowd, and you can do anything you set your mind to. And developing this as a hobby, and it's turned into something that, I'll be honest, I'm humble, but I'm proud of it. And retirement, the special thing about retirement is it gives you that opportunity. And a lot of it goes back to you and me in that very first discussion we had. And it's great that 6 years later, you and I are still talking and we're friends. That's a neat part of my life. I thank you.
Thank you. I love walking life with you, buddy.
There you go, man.
Now let's get to some of your questions on rocking retirement. And again, if you have a question for me, you can share it via audio or in writing at rogerwhitney.com/ask Roger. So the first question comes from Steve on rollovers. Steve says, "Hey, Roger, love the podcast." Awesome, Steve. He says he has a few questions regarding 401ks from previous employers, 100% pre-tax. And he's kept them at his former employers because they had good investment options. But essentially his question is, he says, it's always been my understanding there is no tax burden at the time of transfer by doing a direct rollover, a transfer from one plan to the other, or from one plan to an IRA. But he's always wondered if there were any future reporting complications. I assume at the time of transfer, all the accounts will be liquidated and moved to new accounts in my current plan, creating capital gains for the existing funds. Is this something I need to concern myself about? Hey, Steve, it isn't, because you don't really have to worry about reporting in pre-tax 401ks. If everything is liquidated to move the money to a new 401k or to an IRA, there are no capital gains. There are gains perhaps, but they're not taxable because they're all under this umbrella of a 401k or an IRA. So you can buy and sell all day long and there isn't any tax implication. So you don't have to worry about the reporting on any of that. His second question is, should I be concerned about timing? I assume that if I transfer, say, 401k-A to 401k-B, that they're going to liquidate everything. It's going to take maybe a week or so to move the money from one to the other. And what happens if the markets go up? Steve, I wouldn't worry too much about that. If you first make your case as to why you're consolidating the accounts, and I think you've done well in that, hey, some of the former employers, you're like, I like this. It's working for me. Why move it? So I like that you've thought about that. But when you get to the point of consolidation, as long as you do it efficiently so it doesn't drag on for months, I wouldn't worry at all about being out of the market in any way. It may affect you on the short term, either good or bad, and that's just going to be luck. But from a marathon perspective, it's not going to have a big difference at all. So great question. Thanks so much, Steve. Our next question is from Jimmy on Social Security benefits. And he has a fairly complicated one in that he's 58. He's planning on taking Social Security at 62. His son is 27 and has been disabled his entire life. And his wife is the primary caregiver. And he wants to know, how does this work with Social Security? So, Jimmy, if you're going to apply for Social Security at age 62, you're going to receive roughly 70% of what your benefit would have been at your primary insurance or your full retirement age. So you're going to have a reduced benefit because you're taking it early. Now, statistically, just FYI, assuming you live to full retirement age, all the numbers work out as to whether you take it at 62 or at full retirement age or at age 70. All those numbers, in theory, work out if you live to full retirement age. Now, your spousal benefit. So spousal benefits in general, if they don't have their own record to claim on, they're going to receive 1/2 of your primary insurance amount. And they have to be at least 62 to start getting that. And if you ended up deciding to delay after your full retirement age, their benefit isn't going to increase. They're just going to get 1/2 of what your full retirement age benefit would be. Now, if you file at 62, they're going to get 1/2 of whatever your benefit is going to be. And with a spousal benefit, they can't claim until the primary person claims. Now, there's an exception to that, Jimmy, and that is if a spouse is caring for a child who is under age 16 or one who is disabled. So that probably is going to apply in your case. And also in your case, when a parent of a child with special needs retires or begins receiving Social Security benefits, the child may qualify for Social Security disability insurance based on the parent's work ethic or work record, So when the worker files, the caretaker parent may file, even if they're under 62, and all of this is going to be subject to the Social Security family benefit limit. Jimmy, this is really a case where you need to work closely with either someone who all they do is Social Security and or directly with the Social Security Administration. There are a lot of nuances here, and this is regulatory stuff, and it looks like there's possibilities to maximize this more than most. You have other strategies that are a little bit more available to you because of this situation. So I would definitely meet with the Social Security Administration, probably multiple times and preferably with the same person, so you can start to build some rapport so they really understand it so you can navigate this, because it's going to be a little bit more treacherous than most in terms of figuring all this out. So our last question comes from Peter, and Peter has a radical idea. His wife and he are 62 years old. They have multiple millions in pre-tax accounts, all traditional, which is about half their net worth. They are overfunded for retirement, no mortgage, definitely overfunded for retirement. And here's what he says. Here's my radical plan. I'm going to start Social Security at 62. I'm not going to do any Roth conversions or harvest remaining dollars out of the tax bracket. This would push our tax liability out about 10 years or so. Yes, I understand in 10 years, we'd be paying Uncle Sam RMDs. To us, doing Roth conversions is likely chasing a tail. Say we converted $100,000 a year, he says. We're going to be paying 22 to 24% on that. Our retirement accounts will likely keep growing and we'd still have massive RMD bills later on. Plus, I look at the Roth as something that's not really for us. It's our kids' money. Also on Social Security, I've done the calculations. The break even between taking it at 62 and taking it at 70 is past 80 before any of us reap the benefits. So I'm just going to basically draw my after-tax assets and then start going to my IRA assets. We'd love to hear your opinion. Talk me off the ledge, please. Well, Peter, I don't know if you're necessarily on an edge. If you think of your projected RMDs, if you take $3 million, grow it by 5%, assuming you never touched it before age 72, your RMD is going to be about $181,000, assuming 5% growth. If you think of the kids, whatever they inherit, they're going to have to take it out within 10 years. So if you don't do any Roth conversions, they're going to have 10 years of income off of whatever it is you leave them, whether it's a pre-tax account or a Roth account. So if we take that, let's assume you die at 72 when your RMDs are going to happen. Your $3 million growing at 5% grows to about $4.7 million. They're going to have to take that out over 10 years. So they're probably going to be in really high tax brackets. You may not care about that, but you can run the calculations. I do think you make a really important point of chasing the tail. There are a lot of assumptions that go into which one will likely give you the best bang for your buck. As you point out, you're going to be paying 22 to 24% taxes today. If you do Roth conversions or if you take money out today, why not just delay that? And there are many people in the planning community that agree with you. I think the key question here, Peter, is what are you trying to optimize for? I think that's a question that gets lost a lot in planning. What are we trying to optimize for? Because we read these articles about whether it's Roth conversions or Social Security strategies, etc. What are we trying to optimize for? If we're trying to optimize for our kids, more multi-generational, perhaps Roth conversions make more sense. If you're trying to optimize for the survivor benefit on Social Security, maybe one of you waiting to 70 makes sense. In your case, you state that you're way overfunded. And if you don't have any legacy goals, then it's really optimizing for the near term, which is the certain term, and not this long-term planning. That's one reason why I think all of these kinds of discussions happen in the optimization phase of retirement planning, not the beginning. If you remember, retirement planning should be feasibility, making the plan resilient, and then optimizing the plan. Those first two things have to come first. And a lot of times what happens is people put the optimization part first because they read an article, they've been inundated with strategies that you have to be thinking about now. But if you know your plan is feasible, you know it's really resilient, all this optimization stuff, whether you jump off that ledge or not, Peter, likely will not make a difference in your life. So it's a matter of, even if you left money on the table, do you really care if it cost you a ton of time and friction to go optimize it? And I'm all for optimizing up to a point, but I don't think what you're proposing is crazy. It just introduces new risks, tax risk on future tax rates. You don't know whether you're going to be right or not until after the fact. So I wouldn't freak out about it, Peter. You do you, baby. Now let's go set a smart sprint.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to set a little baby step we can take in the next 7 days to win this marathon. So in the next 7 days, start to put your plan together. You've heard us talk about vision and non-financial things and financial things. What do you need to be doing next? What little baby step do you need to do next to start this process? Figure that out and then just get to that stop sign. So I'm really excited for next week. We are going to be hearing from fellow listeners on their wisdom from retirement. You have a great week.
Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize this is helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.